Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Ooh, I hadn't thought about how much echo is in here. My name is Carrie Miller. I'm Associate Vice President Indigenous for Curriculum Research and Scholarship. And I want to welcome you here today as we on campus celebrate Orange T-Shirt Day. Sean Carlton was just reminding me that this is the 10th anniversary of the first Orange T-Shirt Day. So I think it's very fitting that our campus has embraced this so strongly. I wanted to invite up Donna Green. She is a residential school survivor, a Cree woman from northern Manitoba, the Barron River community, and Manitoba's first Indigenous principal. She'll be opening us up in a good way today.
Good morning, everyone, on this momentous occasion. It's nice to see that ray of orange throughout the room. I acknowledge the presence of the other elder that is here right now and welcome everyone. I'm glad you could be here. Creator, we give thanks for this wonderful day. We give thanks for the opportunity to be able to get together and to acknowledge tragedies that happened to young children many years ago. I ask your blessing for those that are here. I ask for us to be mindful of what needs to be done and what needs to be said, what needs to be felt, and what needs to be learned. I thank you, Creator, for those that organize this occasion every year, as it means a lot to those of us who have gone through what others have gone through in many, many years. On that, I thank you, Creator, for all our blessings, for all our acknowledgements of our differences and our efforts to reconcile them. Egosi.
Miigwech so much for that beautiful opening. I would now like to introduce Dr. Sean Carlton. Sean Carlton is a settler historian and assistant professor in the Departments of History and Indigenous Studies. He's the author of Lessons in Legitimacy, Colonialism, Capitalism, and the Rise of State Schooling in British Columbia. And here he's going to be presenting on Truth Before Reconciliation, how to identify and confront residential school denialism.
Okay, well, first thanks to Elder Green for getting us started in a good way, and to Carrie Miller and her team for the invitation and very kind introduction. And most importantly, thanks to all of you folks for gathering, witnessing, and holding space together today to show that we here at the University of Manitoba are committed to putting truth before reconciliation. I'm going to talk more about that. I'm grateful to you all for making time to connect and learn more about the importance of education in truth-telling, healing, justice, and reconciliation with our teaching today. As a non-Indigenous settler historian, I'm very honored to kick us off this morning. Thinking about residential school history, yes, but also why we need to fight so hard for the truth. But I also do this work to honor a survivor in my family who attended the St. Michael's Indian Residential School in British Columbia, where I'm from. In Indigenous Studies, has anyone taken a class with me or Professor Miller or our colleagues, you'll know that we talk about positioning ourselves as a key to understanding the work that we do. And I wanted to share this before I begin to outline some of the ways that I think we can honor survivors and their truth-telling about residential schooling, hold space for that truth-telling, so that we can combat some of the ongoing legacies today. So what I want to do this morning to kick us off is talk more about some of my research that is trying to grapple with and confront the growing phenomenon of residential school denialism, focusing specifically on the case of former Senator Lynn Beck and what it can teach us about how to identify and confront denialism more broadly. Now, Beck, as perhaps the most notable person spreading denialism, and I'll explain what that is in just a moment, but Beck has received a lot of news recently, not good news. She illegally donated to Donald Trump's failed re-election campaign. She sat in the Senate maskless during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then in January 2021, she announced her early retirement from the Red Chamber, Canada's Senate. Mostly because the Senate was, thanks to the work of Indigenous Senator Mary Jane McCallum here in Manitoba, going to hold a vote to expel her for some of the comments that she made and refused to apologize for. And if expelled, Beck wouldn't be entitled to her full pension. As we'll talk about, denialists desperately want a platform to spread misinformation, but they don't like facing any consequences for their actions. There is, in short, a lot to the Beck saga, and I won't have time to cover all the twists and turns today in the 50 minutes I have. Instead, my work looks specifically at Beck's controversial 2017 Senate speech and the 100 support letters she received and then posted to her Senate website and refused to remove for a number of years, which is really at the heart of the Beck story, and I think reveals a lot about the denialism that we see in our daily lives. So what my talk this morning is going to do is historicize, contextualize, and theorize residential school denialism to give us a frame, to help us understand it, rather than just rando comments on the internet or mean things that people say. Trying to understand what's going on here, why people use this as a way of undercutting survivor truth-telling. And then what I'm going to do is use that frame to critically examine Beck's public comments and her support letters, to show how they embrace and promote residential school denialism as part of an attack on truth and reconciliation. And all of this really, I think, can teach us important lessons about how to both identify and confront the growing phenomenon of residential school denialism, and in our daily lives, play a role in holding space for survivor truth-telling. And I'll note that while I've taken care to try and avoid traumatic content about residential schools, the presentation does contain some details that may be upsetting. I know we're gathered here in a good way, and I've put the Indian Residential School Survivors and Family Crisis Line number here. You know, we're gathered here as a group, as a community today, so I'm sticking around until the end so that we can talk and debrief if you need more resources. Wanting to remind us that we're here to do difficult work, but we do that as a community. Okay, let's get started. Getting ahead of myself there. In March 2017, Lynn Beck, a conservative senator here, and and shockingly, a member of the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, delivered a speech defending Canada's Indian residential school system as being, quote, well-intentioned. Beag briefly admitted that mistakes were made, but she spent the majority of her speech insisting that an emphasis on the system's positives will, quote, help Canada's Native people to thrive as victors, not victims. Beag's speech, made only a year after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report, showing Canadians the evidence of how residential schools constituted genocide, sparked an intense public controversy. The senator's attempts to put a positive spin on what even Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister who appointed Beag to the Senate, called a sad chapter in Canada's history, was not appreciated by many, including her fellow senator and the former chair of the TRC and a U of M graduate, Murray Sinclair, who suggested that Beag and other residential school deniers were, quote, dim-witted. Even the Anglican Church, which ran a third of the schools across Canada, including the Pelican Lake Residential School near Dryden, Ontario, where Beag lives, weighed into the debate to clarify that, in fact, nothing good came from the schools. The church, like the TRC and historians such as myself, note that while a small minority of survivors speak of positive school experiences on a personal level, those experiences must be understood as occurring in the wider context of a genocidal school system designed to kill the Indian in the child. Despite facing widespread criticism, Beag refused to apologize for her well-intentioned speech. Instead, the senator stood behind her positive perspective, even attacking criticism of her speech as fake news and exaggeration. Beag doubled down on her defense of residential schooling, arguing, quote, there are shining examples from sea to sea of people who owe their lives to the schools. When pressed on how Indigenous peoples, especially the many former students who were physically and sexually abused in the schools, including my own family member, how they might feel about these statements, Beag elaborated, quote, I've suffered with them. I appreciate their suffering more than they'll ever know, but the best way to heal is to move forward together, not to blame, not to point fingers, not to live in the past. You know you've really stepped in it when the Beaverton, which is a satirical news site kind of like The Onion in the US, has a good laugh at your expense, right? Saying, Senator Beag demands residential school survivors apologize for her suffering. When Beag was confronted directly by reporters about her Senate speech, and asked directly if she had even read the TRC report to better understand the history and ongoing legacies of these schools, Beag simply stated, and this is important, I don't need any more education. As a result of her comments, Beag was removed from the Senate Committee on Indigenous Issues, and she was later kicked out of the Conservative caucus. But she retained her Senate seat for another 4 years and used her platform as a senator to popularize residential school denialism, to hold space for it. Now, residential school denialism, to be clear, is not the denial that the system existed, but rather, by definition, denialism is the rejection or the attempt to twist, misrepresent, distort, or discredit basic facts rooted in well-documented evidence in favor of more controversial positions. In this way, residential school denialism is similar to climate change denialism or vaccine denialism and other kinds of denialism that we see all the time in our current age of misinformation. Denialism, then, is a deliberate strategy used to try and shake or undermine public confidence in something. And in this case, it is about truth and reconciliation, and I'll explain why in a moment. While not wanting former students of residential schools to dwell on their victimization at the hands of state and church officials, as Elder Green mentioned, in the aftermath of her 2017 comments, Bayek quickly constructed herself as the victim of politically motivated attacks on free speech. Rather than reflection, Bayek dug in and fortified her position using her Senate website, this is a screenshot of her Senate website. And what she did is she used this to post the full text of her Senate speech, as well as further personal statements and a selection of letters that she received supporting her comments. So she's using her publicly funded website to defend herself and to support her ideas further. It's tempting to stereotype those who engage in residential school denialism as being ignorant bigots, or to simply ignore them so as to deny them the recognition they seek for themselves and their ideas. Like, why don't we just leave this alone? Silence, some say, stars deniers of their sustenance, which is dialogue, the ability to promote these ideas and spread them. Some turn to authority, that is, institutions, police, or even the government to perhaps shut down talks, outlaw these kinds of speech acts. And while these have their merits, it often tends to give denialists what they want most, which is a victim complex, which they can use to then platform and spread their ideas further. So what do we do? Well, Murray Sinclair suggests a different approach that I try to amplify and build on in my work, and I want to emphasize today and invite folks to consider. Sinclair argues that it is not enough for us to simply yell at deniers and knock them down. Instead, what we need to do is try and understand their reasoning and show that they are wrong. He elaborates saying, quote, "I've always been convinced that while we may not deal with all of the denialists, we can at least take away their tools. And by challenging the comments of high-profile people like Bayek and others, which I will talk about towards the end of the talk, Sinclair is hopeful that denialists will have a diminishing population of people who will believe them." Sinclair, in short, advocates a strategy of engagement to contain, disprove, and discredit denialists. Taking away the tools of residential school denialism, though, requires a better understanding of those tools and how and why people employ and defend them. In that spirit, my work documents and interrogates the Bayek controversy as a way of comprehending and confronting not just Bayek as a person, but the phenomenon of residential school denialism in Canada generally. And this, I think, is the work of holding space that I'm going to try and model today. It's important first, though, to begin by emphasizing that residential school denialism is actually not a new phenomenon. We are seeing a rise and an uptick in some of this, but we need to understand that downplaying or minimizing the destructive effects of residential schooling for Indigenous children has a much longer history in Canada. I would argue going back to the origins of the system in the 1880s, at least. For much of the system's history, state and church officials in charge of running the system liken the schools to a humanitarian, even sacred in the Christian sense, enterprise designed to save Indigenous communities from extinction in the face of a so-called higher form of civilization. That was the rhetoric that was used to justify this system. Even when faced with irrefutable evidence of poor instruction and horrific conditions in many of the schools, officials mostly clung to that humanitarian discourse and discredited the system's detractors, including many Indigenous parents and students, but also non-Indigenous experts at the time as well. Right, we often hear, oh, well, we can't criticize the past based on the values of today. Okay, well, let's use the values of the early 1900s as the system was still getting started. And Dr. Peter Bryce, who was the Department of Indian Affairs' medical expert, he was commissioned by the department to investigate health conditions in the early residential schools. And his findings that he published in 1907 in a report to the department slammed the system for its abnormally high rate of student death and disease that he suggested was exacerbated by overcrowding, poor nutrition, and a lack of proper sanitation at many of the schools. So many of the things that Canadians are now learning about in the 2020s were well known to the department in the early 1900s. In fact, I've got a newspaper article here. This is from Vancouver Island. So Bryce's report was not just seen by department officials, it was leaked to the press. Many Canadians would have understood what that report said, including this newspaper article, which states Indian schools deal out death. Startling rate of mortality is shown in report to the department, 25% mortality rate. That's 1 in 4 Indigenous children that go to the school don't come out. So the kinds of reckoning that we were doing in the 21st century was sitting right there in the department's office in 1907 and was being read in the newspapers. This is before TV and radio and other forms of communication. This was it, right? This information was in front of many Canadians at the time. Instead of rectifying the system's obvious problems, taking that report as an opportunity to pause and figure out what's going on and fix it, listen to what Indigenous communities were saying, the department buried Bryce's report. As a medical expert, Bryce tried to blow the whistle on the school system in its initial phase. He's very frustrated by the department's lack of a movement on this issue. He then gets pushed out of the public service altogether for his criticisms. And then he goes on to publish his original report, as well as many communication letters and different things from the department showing their lack of concern or care. And he publishes a book in 1922 calling the system a national crime. Despite all of this, officials chose to selectively focus on the positives, thinking about the ways that the system could be improved, perhaps, or could continue to do its work. And the system was allowed to continue until the mid-1990s. So that humanitarian discourse was confronted, it was disproven, and yet people continued to use it to justify the system for another 80 years after Bryce's report. That's the hard part. It was not until former students began publishing accounts of their abuse in schools and organizing outright for redress starting in the 1980s that this humanitarian discourse about residential schooling started to shift significantly in the mainstream. As more students spoke out about their school experiences, they emboldened others to come forward, to break their silence, to tell their truths, eventually sparking a movement led by former students to collectively seek compensation and acknowledgement for their time spent in the institutions and the damage that system created. And Orange Shirt Day is a part of that ongoing organizing. Phyllis Webb said, in BC, went to the Williams Lake Residential School in the sort of interior of the province, and we can understand, acts like this as being part of this movement of survivor-led truth-telling. With many state and church officials still denying any wrongdoing in the 1980s and 90s, students forced the issue by launching the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, which the government of Canada chose to settle out of court, saving a lot of money in the process, by agreeing to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2006-2007. And this agreement put in motion the government's official apology for residential schools in 2008. Right? It didn't happen out of the goodness of their heart. It was a condition of the residential school settlement agreement. As well, they agreed to support an independent Truth and Reconciliation Commission to interview survivors, do historical research, and raise national awareness about residential schooling. Again, all as part of the remedy for this particular settlement. The TRC published its final report in 2015, and the conclusions shocked many Canadians, but confirmed what generations of Indigenous people, historians, experts like Dr. Bryce, had already well understood. And this is the unveiling of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report in Ottawa, and in the middle there is Justice Murray Sinclair. The Commission, however, made clear that shaming and pointing out wrongdoing was not the TRC's mandate, even if that's the feelings that Canadians had when they read it. Instead, the focus on truth determination was intended to lay the foundation for the important question of reconciliation, or strengthening relations between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. The TRC made very clear in the beginning of the report that we must have truth before reconciliation. In fact, they lay out a very clear formula. That first we need to understand the truth that survivors are telling us about their experiences. When we can understand that truth, then we can have healing and justice. And only once we have healing and justice will we have reconciliation. It's a process. Now, many Canadians have embraced the challenge put forward by the TRC and are, in differing ways, perhaps slowly, reckoning with Canada's colonial past to create a better future. It's part of the work that we are doing here today. Others, like Bayek, however, are choosing to dispute, deny, and discredit the Commission's findings as an excuse to avoid participating in reconciliation. You don't have to deal with a history that you deny. If we take that TRC's basic formula of truth first, truth will lead to healing and justice. Healing and justice will lead to reconciliation. Denialists know that. They understand this formula. So they go back to the beginning and quibble with the truth to slow down or prevent the process of healing, justice, and reconciliation. Now, to be sure, grappling with matters of genocide is not easy. But it is the task that Indigenous, and in particular non-Indigenous people, like myself, living in what is currently Canada, are being asked to do in this era of truth and reconciliation. This is our major challenge, as laid out by the TRC. So how can we do this work? Well, first, scholarly literature in the field of genocide studies can actually help shed light on how different countries around the world are dealing with the legacies of different kinds of genocide and addressing the phenomenon of denialism in particular. Many genocide scholars, including our colleague at the university here, Andrew Wolford, will tell you that denial is often understood as the 8th and final step of a genocide. So it's not unsurprising. Canada is not unique in this, right? It is a common feature of contexts of genocide. Political scientist Adam Jones argues that the manipulation of memory and history, the distortion of it, the misrepresentation of it to justify things, often occurs in the aftermath of genocides. In looking at Germany's grappling with the Jewish Holocaust as an example, he shows how a willful amnesia and a politicized forgetting emerged in the immediate post-war period as a way to distance the country and its citizens from its very recent Nazi past and its ongoing effects. In reflecting on the psychology of denialism, Jones argues that individual and collective narcissism play a pivotal role in buttressing denial. In many contexts, a denialist stance heads off the cognitive dissonance between one's preferred view of self and country and the grimmer reality. There's also usually an element of material self-interest baked into denialism. Insights from genocide studies overlap with lessons from recent Indigenous studies literature on the role of denialism in Canada. Scholars such as our former colleagues, Gina Starblanket and Dallas Hunt, illustrate how Canadians like to imagine that they've always acted with peaceful good intentions. I'm sure you've bumped up against this kind of mythology before, right? Canadians do not like to hear that their country was founded through frauds, abuses, and violence perpetrated against Indigenous people, not just in the past, but on an ongoing basis. Instead of confronting this difficult reality and changing it, some Canadians choose to seek refuge in myths of benevolence and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that justify colonial policy, past and present, as being well-intentioned, even necessary, and enlightened. To be Canadian, according to Stolo author Lee Maracle, is to be sunk in deep denial. Instead of seeing reconciliation as an opportunity to change their relations in these lands, Maracle argues that many Canadians, quote, tend toward defensiveness. It's also helpful to theorize the role of denialism in colonial societies, and here I turn to the work of anti-colonial writers like A.M. César, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi. In particular, Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonized, which consists of a psychological profile of both based on the author's own experiences in North Africa, is especially insightful because it looks at the role of denial in legitimizing colonialism as commonsensical, as normal and natural. Well, Indigenous scholars, such as our colleague here at the university, Emma LaRocque, have examined Memi's portrait of the colonized in relation to Indigenous struggles in Canada. I think it's helpful to pause for a second and focus on Memi's portrait of the colonizer, which often gets ignored, and its applicability to Canadian settlers. And this aspect of Memi's work has received less attention, but I think it can be very instructive in helping us understand what's going on with denialism that we see. So Memi argues that colonizers are daily confronted with the reality of the illegitimacy of their status. Their very existence is a crisis of legitimacy. Whether colonizers are immigrants or are born in the colonies, he argues, they are always, even if only subconsciously, plagued by the question, what entitles me to live here? Fears about retribution and revenge by the colonized only stoke an ever kind of present colonial anxiety. And I think anyone who's read Star Blanket and Hunt's new book on the Gerald Stanley trial, if anyone's taken Indigenous Studies 1240 with me, I think they make clear that this operates on a daily level in Canada too. In an attempt to resolve these unsettled feelings, colonizers invent and deploy a whole host of strategies to protect their position of privilege in the colonies and to prove to themselves and to others the legitimacy of their existence, their right to live and prosper. In addition to creating specific laws and the creation of ghettos, prisons, and schools to contain and control the colonized physically, Memi contends that colonizers also invent and invest themselves in a series of myths and stereotypes, propagated through various channels, including art and education, the writing of history, to rationalize the oppressive colonial relationship that underpins the material prosperity of colonizers as natural and inevitable, and most importantly, unchangeable. Now, although Memi argues that all colonizers benefit from colonialism, he differentiates the behavior of two main groups. First, the colonizer who refuses, and second, the colonizer who accepts. Don't have time to get all into this. Again, if you want to take a course in Indigenous studies, we can get into Memi a little bit more, but in short, the colonizer who refuses comes to the realization that colonialism is in fact unjust and vows to challenge that oppression and fight for the freedom of colonized people. This, though, is no easy task, because the liberation of the colonized requires colonizers to question and challenge the legitimacy of their own existence and figure out a new way of living, which is a lot of work. As a result, Memi argues that most colonizers simply resign themselves to accept colonialism and its benefits, becoming a colonizer who accepts. Okay, that's enough theory for early in the morning, right? My argument is that properly historicized, contextualized, and theorized, residential school denialism can be understood as a powerful tool of protecting the status quo in colonial settings, including such as Canada. So it's not random, right? It plays a particular role here in keeping things the way they are. Rather than unsettle the history of Canada and confront the ongoing legacy of colonization, including things like residential schools, as Memi's The Colonizer Who Refuses might do, Some Canadians, like Beck, are employing the tools of Memes the colonizer who accepts. That is, they deploy a denialist discourse that justifies their existence, their home on native land, through a combination of degrading Indigenous people and clinging to selective and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that they think absolves them of wrongdoing and therefore justifies their lack of support for reconciliation. So yes, it might be random trolls on the internet, but there actually is something going on at the core of why people do this and why it's so alluring to many people. Okay, back to Beck. Beck's controversial comments in the Senate in 2017, and we're going to use this as an example to root all of this and understand it, okay? So her Senate speech defending residential schooling and the kinds of comments that it produced need to be understood in this wider strategy as a tool for denying the injustices of the past and present to safeguard colonial power and privilege in the unsettling time of truth and reconciliation. Now, I don't have time to fully get into Beck's speech, but just a couple of points before I move on to talk about her support letters, which is really the focus of my analysis, and I think we can see how this misinformation spreads in particularly nefarious ways, and might be more familiar to the kinds of denialism that you see on a daily basis. So Beck's speech promoted a whole host of ignorant and incorrect views about Indigenous people and history, including her belief that on balance, residential schooling should be considered beneficial for Indigenous people. In her speech, Beck used what is known as false balance. This is a form of bias that suggests an issue is more balanced between opposing views than the evidence actually suggests. So you use false balance. She uses false balance to contend that the good and the bad are equal parts of the whole residential school story. Beck explained that people only focus on the bad for political reasons and noted that it was her duty to stick up for the other side. The problem with Beck's premise here is that it is not supported by the evidence or historical scholarship. Beck's equal weighting of good and bad reveals her fundamental misunderstanding of the historical consensus, that the problems of the Indian residential school system were systemic, that the problem with residential schooling was not only the individual cases of neglect and abuse, but that for over 100 years, the government colluded with churches to devise, deploy, and defend a genocidal school system that sought to remove children from their families. That's the attack on the group, which is the definition of genocide, often by force, to undercut and attack Indigenous lifeways to support colonization and Canadian nation building. We often talk about residential schooling as just being about assimilation, which serves to hide the kind of undercurrent here that it wasn't just about helping Indigenous people fit into this new society. It was part of this genocidal process of eradicating Indigenous lifeways to gain control of land and create Canada as a colonial country. Whether some students recall positive experiences, which many do, or whether former employees believed in their benevolent intentions, which many argue, this does not change the genocidal effects of the system. Despite the inaccuracy of her comments in the Senate, Beck nevertheless received a lot of support. On the 6th of April, 2017, just a month after making her Senate speech, Beck used her Senate website, which I showed earlier, to release a statement defending her position and thanking people for their support. She claimed that her supporters represent the silent majority of Canada, and she wanted to write to encourage their support. She said, "You are not alone. You are the majority, as has been shown to me with all of the support that I've received." You know where this is going, right? Though declaring that the majority of Canadians supported her position based on, quote, an avalanche of support, the senator was cagey when pressed on evidence for that support. Beck claimed to have received 700 letters that overwhelmingly supported her views. This, however, does not reflect reality. Denialism is all about manipulating evidence to justify a particular position. This is why people do not like what we do at the university, which is spend our time digging into the evidence to help people understand things. Fact-checking is a dangerous occupation in our age of misinformation. But that's what we must do. And an investigation by the Senate ethics officer into Beck's use of her website revealed that the senator in fact received a total of 6,766 letters. Of that total, only 2,389 supported Beck's speech in various ways, while 4,282, the vast majority, were deeply critical of her speech. Though promising to make all of the letters publicly available, Beck, of course, only chose to publish a handful of these statements, 129 in total, all of them in support of her speech in 2017, right? Though she deleted all of them in 2019, the support letters, which I downloaded before they were deleted, need more critical analysis, especially because the 100 letters dated between the 8th of March and the 11th of April 2017, in the month after Beck's speech, openly engage in residential school denialism and show how misinformation can grow and spread quite quickly and can give us some understanding about what we might be able to do when we encounter it. How do we debunk these talking points? Okay, turning now to the selected support letters that Beck chose to showcase on her website between 2017 and 2019, which held space for denialism to proliferate and grow. I just want to give you a sample of some of them today and filter some of the comments through these three clusters or categories that we might be able to identify how denialism how you can identify denialism, why people say certain kinds of things. And I'm going to focus on three clusters here. The first is personal knowledge. The second is ignorance and anti-Indigenous racism. And the third is something I'm calling worldviews in collision, or those that promote assimilation. And what I want to show is that those writing to support Beck and many of the kinds of denialism that we encounter draw in differing ways from these different categories to further advance denialism in keeping with Memi's view of colonizers who accept. So let's start with the personal, perhaps the easiest to understand. I'm not sure you won't be able to see that very clearly, but I'll summarize it for you and give you a sense of this. So she had a comment box on her website. She asked people basically to go and offer these letters of support. And then her office typed them up if they were physical letters or took their emails and things and put them on the website. This is one example from Richard, who the day after the controversy broke, wrote to Beck and used some personal information. So, Many of Bayek's support letters defend residential schools based on varying kinds of personal information. Some authors admit to having direct experience working in the schools, and it is clear that they are seeking refuge in Bayek's comments as a kind of absolution for wrongdoing for themselves and for family members. Pretty easy to understand, right? In fact, the very first letter posted by Bayek is from Richard, who writes on behalf of himself and his partner, who have a combined experience of 26 years in Aboriginal and Métis schools, and thus, quote, witnessed firsthand the positive anecdotes and experiences of those who gained from their attendance at residential schools, right? So a very clear example of like writing to justify your own involvement in the system. While some authors choose to defend their work or the work of family members in residential schools, others spoke of their positive personal experiences of talking with some residential school employees or Indigenous people. And here we can see sort of some lack of critical thinking going on. So here we have a writer who wrote to thank Bayek for, quote, having the courage to say what millions of Canadians have been thinking for years. That yes, there were terrible things that happened at residential schools, but not everyone that attended a residential school had a bad experience. The author bases this conclusion on her experience of once having attended an art exhibit in Fort McMurray in northern Alberta, where she met a native artist who told me how grateful she was to the nuns and priests in her community who ran the school. All of these writers gained personal knowledge from family members or former employees or students looking to make a sale, who spoke favorably about their time in residential schools. And thus they have a hard time accepting the overwhelmingly documented evidence about the system's overall genocidal effects. There's that cognitive dissonance, right? I hear a positive story, so I have a hard time understanding then the evidence that doesn't jive with the weight of evidence here. While some authors wrote to support Bayek based on their personal experience, others admired the senator's stance on residential schools simply because, and I think this is more emblematic or better seen in the kinds of denialism that we see online, etc. Some people liked it simply because it created a space for them to voice their ignorant views about Indigenous people and perpetuate anti-Indigenous racism. These writers remain unconvinced that they should care about Indigenous people. And as a result, they generally accept, buy into, and even propagate racist stereotypes, as Mary pointed out, that serve to demean, diminish, and dehumanize Indigenous people, and deny any responsibility for colonization and, by extension, efforts at reconciliation. Now, the worst of these letters have gotten a lot of public attention, so I'm not going to give the racist ones more of a platform here. But I will give you a sense of some of the ignorance on display. So in terms of ignorant or incorrect views, Bayek's support letters, like Bayek's original speech, are full of incorrect assumptions, rooted in misinformation. Denialism, in fact, thrives on misinformation. So Kevin writes, your remarks to the effect that teachers and leaders involved in the program were by and large well-intentioned are obviously true. It's too bad you are under attack for speaking truthfully. The evidence presented by the TRC reveals that such an assumption is in fact not obviously true. That's the problem. Similarly, C wrote to support Bayek and explains, I feel that the current dialogue, re this part of our history, is grotesquely unbalanced. You are right to mention that it was neither the residential school employees or government intention to be cruel or to wipe out an entire race. Again, here we can see that idea of false balance on display. And the TRC report and the weight of scholarly research, including my own, presents the full evidence to show that while not all employees were cruel, many were. And the government's clear intention from the beginning was to use the system to bring about the end of Indigenous lifeways through coerced assimilation to support Canadian nation building. That's right from the church and state records from the origins of the system. Though many of the support letters Bayek received used personal information or racist and ignorant views to downplay the negative effects of residential schooling, others simply doubled down on the need for assimilation still today, to force Indigenous people to participate in Canadian society. And this aspect of the letters, an undercurrent of denialism generally, has received less attention, but I think needs to be directly confronted. So here, many of the authors cannot or are unwilling to comprehend that Indigenous people have their own cultures, spiritualities, languages, and economic practices that residential schools deliberately and systematically sought to eliminate, eradicate, and replace as part of this process. Simply put, many letter writers here lament the closure of the schools because they still believe in the value of coerced assimilation as a beneficent project of civilizing Indigenous people. So Linda wrote to Bayek, "Like you, I believe the institution of residential schools was well-intentioned and was an attempt to solve the Indian problem by integrating the children into the new way of life in order that they could function with better language, health, and skills. Similarly, Cary, in a letter that draws on all the categories here, argues, certainly the decision to assimilate First Nations into Canada was and remains the correct one. Someone hasn't studied the Treaty of Niagara, as we'll be hearing a little bit later from our colleague in the teach-in, this idea of nation-to-nation relations, right? Rather than forcing Indigenous people to assimilate into Canada. That's a kind of violation of the understanding of what that treaty and agreement was supposed to be and how it was supposed to carry forward and inform Indigenous settler relations. So stay tuned for Marc's talk about that. B takes it further, suggesting, I think residential schools, like imagine writing this, I think residential schools were a noble and honest attempt to treat natives as equals and integrate the community into the new, productive, rewarding Canadian life. Roy, in another letter, personified the unquestioned acceptance of assimilation by defending residential schools in the most self-centered, ethnocentric way possible. This is what he says. The fact is, there are two good things that came out of residential schools. One, when I see an Aboriginal person, I can talk to him or her. And two, they can operate in our modern world. The author then concluded, please hang in there, and do not let the fools who think they can implement all of the recommendations of the TRC committee. It would destroy our nation. Pretty clear. Right, that element of fear or thinking reconciliation is a threat rather than as an opportunity. So these writers promoted the merits of forced assimilation and defended residential schooling and attacks on Indigenous lifeways generally as immensely beneficial to Canada and Canadians because it protects and extends the colonial status quo that they benefit from and draw their power and privilege from. So, whether through personal knowledge, ignorance, and anti-Indigenous racism, or a belief in assimilation as beneficent, or a combination of these Bayek's supporters employ denialism to distance themselves from the effects of residential schooling and to defend ongoing colonization and the power and privilege it affords them as commonsensical. Indeed, Memmi explains that this kind of behavior reassures colonizers who accept that colonization is eternal, and it encourages them to look towards their, quote, future without worries of any kind. Okay, to conclude and think about how we now see all of this manifest in Canada today in quite concerning ways. So although Bayek has now retired, the residential school denialism she helped reinvigorate and popularize remains a barrier to reconciliation today, as Murray Sinclair recently pointed out, identifying it as one of the biggest barriers to us moving forward here. Indeed, Bayek's comments defending residential schooling, trying to undermine public confidence in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, the process of truth and reconciliation work, and the letters that she received supporting her comments are but one example of the growing phenomenon of residential school denialism in Canada today. And here I'll just give some highlights, or lowlights, I guess we could call them. So more recently, a teacher in Abbotsford, BC assigned a homework assignment where students were instructed to search for online articles outlining the positive experiences of residential schools. This has popped up in a number of different schools across the country in recent years, right? All of us in an educational setting will understand that the three links that are, the couple of articles provided here are misleading, right? Many of them repackaging denialist talking points. One of them is just like some dude's personal website, like a blog. So not very rigorous critical thinking skills here. Similarly, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien spread denialism on a Montreal talk radio show where he compared residential schooling to his own private school experience, basically saying, what's the big deal? I think we can all understand the difference between a private boarding school that's helping you to gain access to elite society being very different from residential schooling. And of course, Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs in the 60s and 70s. He played a direct role in sort of managing that system, so he has a vested interest in sort of downplaying the severity of the system and his own role in it, as we saw with some of those personal letters. What else do we have? We have the former leader of the Conservative Party, Aaron O'Toole. He was caught on camera at Toronto Metropolitan University coaching young conservatives on how to manipulate residential school history to score political points. Don't emphasize the conservative origins of the system, talk about John A. Macdonald, who helped create the system. Instead, choose to focus on the Trudeaus and liberal prime ministers and folks like Chrétien who were involved in the system. So sort of politicizing that information rather than an understanding that the residential school system was a bipartisan project. As well, concerningly, a number of academics, including a former employee of the University of Manitoba who has a professor emeritus status, have engaged openly in supporting denialism, denigrating Indigenous communities searching for the former sites of residential schools for potential unmarked graves, suggesting it's all fake news, a big hoax, a lie. It's mostly just a handful of the same sad people, mostly retired or fired academics in this case. But increasingly, politicians have started to legitimize these wacky ideas as a way of garnering support amongst far-right conspiratorial types that would rather believe that this is a hoax or a lie than confront the truth and do something about it. And this is the concerning part, right? Because denialism, as we saw in the Bayek example, can spread and give people more of an opportunity to talk about some of these things. So as a good example, just again, to show you the severity of this, the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, spread the mass grave hoax narrative, suggesting that this is really just fake news. And the current Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, was in Winnipeg just last year giving a fundraising talk for the Frontier Center, which is a far-right think tank that has done much to spread residential school denialism. It funded a book edited by someone who worked in a residential school, collecting all sorts of sort of positive spin takes on residential schooling, to, in 2018, taking out radio ads on the prairies, questioning truths about the system and trying to undermine the legitimacy of the TRC report and the process of truth and reconciliation. So we've got politicians engaging in all of this, spreading it further. This is a column by my colleague Megan Sinclair, thinking about how all of this sort of hatred can manifest into action. And as he talks about in this column, here in our own city, we have an alleged serial killer who targeted Indigenous women, and at the time of his alleged crimes, he was posting residential school denialism. That was the anti-Indigenous rhetoric that he was posting on his social media pages at the time, specifically the mass grave hoax stuff. So these examples all seek to misrepresent residential school history in various ways, but share a commonality, that the goal is to downplay the system's devastating effects. And I think that we need to take these attacks on truth and reconciliation seriously. Okay, I'm doing pretty good on time here, Cary. So denialists then are not just simply dim-witted. My argument is that they are afraid that reconciliation will unsettle their material interests and position of power in a colonial society. In keeping with Memi's profile of the colonizer who accepts, Bayek and other residential school denialists are choosing to seek refuge in an assemblage of misinformation and untruths. But here's the thing. This is a false refuge. Denying the colonial past and present prevents settlers from being part of the project of reconciliation and the efforts to build sustainable and reciprocal relations with Indigenous peoples that could resolve that crisis of legitimacy and help them to live in the lands currently called Canada in good or at least better ways. Thus, contrary to Bayek's response when pressed by a reporter about her defense of residential schools, right, that she didn't need any more education, it is clear that actually what is needed in our current era of truth and reconciliation is more, not less, education about the ongoing effects of Canadian colonization and the opportunities for all in deep, unsettling, and meaningful reconciliation. And that's why we've organized this teach-in focused on these tools today, and the presentations will give you different parts of this. And I'm looking forward to Carrie, Brenda, and Marc's comments. In fact, Murray Sinclair always says that education is what got us into this mess, right? And education is what's needed to get us out. And I want to commend you all for coming and committing to that path of learning and being part of this teach-in today. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was clear in its final report. This is my final point. That reconciliation is not actually an Indigenous problem. It is a Canadian responsibility. And learning how to identify and confront denialism in our daily lives, in our interpersonal relationships, at home, around the dinner table, at the water cooler at work, in the hockey dressing room, in the church basement, wherever you're gathering with people, okay? Confronting these denialist talking points, holding space for truth, is one way that you individually and us as a community can help put truth before reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Sean. So I've introduced myself earlier. I'm Carrie Miller. I'm the Associate Vice President, Indigenous for Curriculum, Scholarship, and Research. I wanted to emphasize a few things about Sean's talk before I jump into mine as a way of transition. And that is to say that racism can exist independent of colonialism, but colonialism never exists without racism. Colonialism is a system in which one group claims preeminent right over the resources of a group that holds them on the basis of the inferiority of that group. When we look at the evidence that Sean showed us, we have to remember that John A. Macdonald, in arguing to establish residential schools, states, and I bring this up because we're talking about parental rights today. He states, "I would not lightly interfere with parental rights, but Indigenous children," I'm paraphrasing, he didn't say Indigenous, "Indigenous children should not be allowed to remain with their parents who are savage in their customs, in their religion," he elaborates, "so that those children may learn to read and write, but then are only Indians who can read and write." It's very clear the intent of the schools was not to educate, but to eliminate the cultural identity and presence of Indigenous people. And that's something that we continue to see in the world today as well, as Russia tries to steal the children of Ukraine, to send them to Russia, to be raised with Russian families, to erase their language, their culture, and their identity. Then and now, these are acts of genocide. It's very important that we all read the 94 calls to action, that we all read the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that we all read the calls to justice of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls inquiry. Because it's from there that we begin our education, that we start to see how much we didn't know and how much we have to learn. We also start to realize how deeply embedded historically these ideas are. One of the things that I like to point out is A few years ago, I had a trip of a lifetime. I went to Hawaii. It was a beautiful place. Waterfalls, lush jungles, ocean views. I'd have loved to stick a flag on that island and claim it as my own. I would have been arrested or perhaps committed for trying to do that. So why, in 1492, when a sailor who did the math wrong and ended up on an island was able to stick a flag in it and say, hey, this is cool, I would like to claim this place? So the next three talks that we're going to move through, starting with mine, is on the doctrine of discovery. The TRC calls to action 45 and 47 call on governments to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous people, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, to reform laws and policies that continue to rely on these concepts. Terra nullius translates as empty land. We perpetuate mythologies of empty land through our ideas of wilderness, through the establishment of national parks, to emphasize this idea of pristine landed emptiness. There is no national park that was created without the removal of Indigenous communities. The very first national park in the world is created in the United States, and 7 bands of Indigenous people, numbering more than 1,000 individuals, was removed to create that park. Okay. So where do these ideas come from? They didn't magically spring forth in 1492. They are deeply embedded in Western thought, and therefore deeply embedded in the Western canon that we still teach in institutions of higher learning. And without being critical of those messages that are embedded in these scholars and authors that we so deeply revere, and deeply revere often for good reason, but overlook these underlying messages that we need to, as a modern society, challenge. So, Marc and Brenda and I originally sort of put this, these 3 talks together after the Vatican came out with statements that the papal bulls had been misunderstood, misinterpreted, and misapplied. Not completely a full-throated rejection of the doctrine, but perhaps a statement that they're no longer meaningful, and even recognizing that they did not respect the dignity of Indigenous people. I'm going to go through a little bit of the history that leads up to those bulls and talk about how they were understood at the time and why those ideas become embedded moving forward. So, arbitrarily picking a certain point in history, the 300s are the point at which Christianity becomes the primary religion of the Roman Empire, an empire which we can all agree was pretty expansionist and colonialist in its own right. In doing so, Christianity had to transition from being an oppositional religion to being a religion that would embrace the attitudes and interests of that empire. So St. Augustine who was trying to develop an understanding of how Romans could be Christian, is the first theologian to offer a theory on war and justice in his book, The City of God. He will suggest that some wars are necessary to amend an evil, citing biblical conflicts in which those attacked are described in various dehumanizing ways, but very clearly throughout are not believers in the correct religion. While today we think of just war in terms of modern conceptions of morality, the question in the Middle Ages and the pre-modern world was when and how warfare could be conducted free of sin, and that was often shaped in these religious terms. So Charlemagne, 500 years later, is declared Holy Roman Emperor, another staunch expansionist, bringing, quote unquote, bringing Christianity into Germany and other areas of Northern Europe. As the defender of the faith, Charlemagne not only protected the papacy, but sought to subdue non-Christian nations. His favorite book, according to his biographer, was St. Augustine's The City of God. Move forward another 500 years. Oh, my math's off. Another 400 years. We have the First Crusade, in which Pope Urban says, remission of sins will be granted for those going thither. Let those who have been accustomed unjustly to wage war against the faithful now go against the infidels and with victory end this war. So in this speech, he characterizes Muslims as pagans who unlawfully seized Christian lands, and basically frames his sermon as Augustinian just war, adding the promise of salvation for participating in it. Deus vult, God wills it. Another 300 years, and we begin to see the papacy issuing bulls, and bulls are essentially these proclamations or documents that were understood to have kind of almost an international law effect. To the extent that there is any kind of international authority in Europe in the Middle Ages, it is the papacy. And keep in mind that in 1400s, we are before the Protestant Reformation. There is not a religious challenge yet to the church in Europe. So Pope Nicholas V in 1452 issues Dum Diversas, granting Portugal the right to reduce non-Christian people to hereditary slavery. This is reconfirmed in bulls in 1455, 56, 81, and 1514. In this bull, he gave Portugal exclusive rights to trade with and conquer African peoples, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, and affirms the right to enslave. When we try to grapple with how Europeans understood the world at that time, their perception of the world was very deeply framed by the Bible. They had no idea of the existence of the continents of North and South America. They understood a world that had 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, which you can see in the map on the left, which is from a document in 1472, to be one where these 3 continents are divided by the Mediterranean Sea and surrounded by the ocean. You'll see that each of those continents are associated with another name. Ham, Shem, and Jephthah the three sons of Noah. So from their perspective, this makes sense. Everyone on earth is related to Adam and Eve as descended through the three sons of Noah that are the fathers of the three continents. You can see on the right a map from 1485, a more accurate map. You can see the efforts of the Portuguese in identifying the coast of Africa, but not completely up the other side, where they start getting very confused about the geography. Both of these maps have the Middle East as the center. In specific, Jerusalem as the center. And this is a worldview that is profoundly challenged when we have arrival in the Americas. But I wanted to tie this in with kingship. Starting with Charlemagne, we have the anointing of kings by religious leaders to justify their leadership and rule of European nations. As part of the regalia of rulership, which we saw very recently on display in the coronation of King Charles, is the orb. The orb is a spherical representation of the map on the left. It is the round sphere with that tripart division marking, and of course, Jerusalem in the center where you have the cross. It is a representation of the temporal power of the monarch, a power which is perceived as derived from God. So Pope Alexander VI becomes Pope in 1492. He is the only Pope to come from Spain, and conveniently is Pope for the Spanish donation. The bull Inter Caetera, which basically says any lands yet to be discovered that is held by non-Christians belongs to Spain. Portugal will complain about this. They'll say prior bulls give us some preeminence. So the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 essentially divides the world in half with a line cutting down through what is today the hump of South America, because they didn't know it was there yet. They just drew a line. They said this half is Portuguese, this half is Spanish. Whichever Catholic monarch arrives and finds non-Christian people, you may conquer and subdue. So, and this explains honestly why Brazil speaks Portuguese today, because they're on that particular side of a line drawn on a sphere arbitrarily. The New World conquest enriches Europe enormously. Between 1500 and 1650, Europe harvested 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver from the Americas, all of which is obtained through indigenous labor. As these ships came back to Seville, they endowed the church. This particular image is the altar in the coastal city of Seville that most of those ships docked into. That is gold from the Americas that has been transformed from the original pieces of indigenous artwork to serve a different purpose. It is the metals of the Americas that begin the process in Europe of having metals replace land as a mark of wealth and increased social mobility. In the middle of this, European thinkers are still trying to figure out what's over there. What is this thing that we didn't know about, and what does it mean? These continents and the peoples who live on them. And you began to have a difference of opinion. Some argued that Indigenous people were human. Others argued that we must not be because you couldn't demonstrate how we were related to Adam and Eve. So, as conquistadors increasingly began to work Indigenous people to death, the Spanish Crown tried to correct this with the laws of Burgos. The laws of Burgos attempted to prevent genocide from forced labor. They identified Indigenous people as subjects of the Crown and indicated that any conquistadors had to inform a people that they were subjects of the Spanish Crown and should be Christian before they could be legally attacked. The document they read for this was called the Requerimiento, and it was usually read in Latin or Spanish to populations who didn't know that language. When they refused Christianity, conflict would directly ensue. Wrong way. There we go. So the conflicts continue, genocide continues. And so in 1529, Pope Clement VII issues the bull Inter Arcana, confirming that Charles V as King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor has claim to the Americas, stating, quote, "We trust that as long as you are on earth, you will compel and with all zeal cause the barbarian nations to come to the knowledge of God, the maker and founder of all things, not only by edicts and admonitions, but by force and arms if needful, in order that their souls partake of the heavenly kingdom." This is a very clear statement that force is allowable for bringing Christianity to a people. And to me, demonstrates that we are not taking the papal documents out of context when we say that the doctrine of discovery that is framed and based on them is based on violence and genocide and racism. In 1537, Sublimus Deus, another papal bull put out by Pope Paul III. It makes enslavement of Indigenous peoples in the Americas illegal and states that they are rational human beings who have rights to freedom and private property even if they are heathen. And it is accompanied by a papal brief that threatened excommunication for anyone in violation. However, this bull was annulled the following year due to protests against it by the Spanish king and Holy Roman Emperor. Scholars have pointed out that this bull does not negate the legal grounds put forth in other bulls, that Indigenous peoples who resisted and rejected Christianity could be attacked and enslaved, as the conflict would then fall under the definition of just war. So this takes us really to the first international discussion of human rights. And as much as there were many Spaniards seeking to enrich themselves off of enslavement and extraction of resources in a foreign land, there were others who fundamentally saw this as wrong. Bartolomé de las Casas was among the first conquistadors into North America and was so cognitively challenged by what he was being asked to do by his commanding officers that he gave away all his belongings, became a Dominican monk, and worked tirelessly for the rest of his life to try to convince the world of the humanity of Indigenous people and their rights to their property and lives and cultures. He wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies, which is an account of how the Spanish moved forward through this destruction in the Caribbean, if you're interested in seeing his eyewitness account. But there was another man, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a scholar who had never left Europe, who argued that Indigenous people in the Americas were Aristotle's homunculi. Aristotle had posited that somewhere in the world was a race of beings that would be the perfect slaves, that would not be humans and require human rights. And so the Spanish crown called for a debate between these two individuals. And it wasn't a debate like we're familiar with right now, all of these candidate debates which are kind of back and forth. This was more like presenting a court case, where one side presents their evidence over several days, and then the other side presents their evidence over several days. And they assigned 70 scholars from Spain to listen to these deliberations. The scholars, in the end, supported supported Bartolomé de las Casas. They said, yes, Indigenous people are human beings. They do have souls. They are capable of being saved. But, they said, the papal bulls show us that because they are not Christian, they do not have the right to their property. We do not have to return it, and we can move forward with colonization. So, these bulls were interpreted to give Spanish and Portuguese monarchs the rights to land and jurisdiction over any lands they discovered, based on the idea that non-Christian leaders did not have legitimate authority and should be replaced peacefully or by force for the good of the people they ruled. Rather than rejecting this principle, other European monarchs, such as the French and the British, simply modified the rule so that they could also gain lands and jurisdiction by discovery. For example, King Francis I convinced Pope Clement VII to interpret inter caetera to apply only to lands that had been discovered by the time it was issued in 1493, so that France could legitimately claim discovery and jurisdiction over Canada, which Jacques Cartier had quote-unquote discovered in 1534. To the millions of Indigenous people living in the Americas, they knew it was here. They knew they were here. They knew the other Indigenous nations were here because they traded with them. There was nothing to discover. There were perhaps opportunities to learn about one another. But when Europeans came and said, we left our homeland because we are hungry. We left our homeland because we were prosecuted. Indigenous people found ways to share the land with them. Because one of the foundational values of most Indigenous societies, if not all, is the right to live on the land and get your sustenance from it, to eat from it. And we see this symbolized in Indigenous agreements like the dish with one spoon, where nations throughout the Great Lakes, on both sides of what is now the Canadian border, agreed amongst themselves that the lands that they used were one bowl that all the nations ate from with one spoon. And the way that they interpreted this to the colonizers was that this land is now not for sale unless every single chief involved in this agreement of all of these varied nations agrees to that. Because they had learned that those who had come not to share the land and not to share in the food and the bounty of the land, but to do something else. So I'm a little over time here. Oops, I'm going the wrong way anyway. But I do want to stop here because I think it's really important for us to think about how we look at our textbooks. I know we have many textbooks today that are changing, but these are two that over the course of my lifetime I've seen assigned by faculty members around me. I originally taught in the United States. You'll see a map there from 1750, a period before the US exists, a period during which the majority of all of these territories are still held by Indigenous people. And by the way, the section that was not claimed by Europeans, the textbook maker thought so unimportant you could just write text right over that. Okay? It is a map that is already showing an Indigenous absence that is a complete lie in 1750, a year in which European powers are actively soliciting and begging Indigenous people to fight on their side because of their power, strength, and agricultural production. Similarly, we have on the other side a map of Canada at Confederation. We see marked Rupert's Land, a tract of land that one day the King of England just said, hey, I'm going to give this to my brother. Maybe he'll go over there and not revolt against me. Okay? And land that becomes the jurisdiction of the Hudson Bay Company, which at Confederation sells it to Canada for $5 million without consulting a single Indigenous person, even though no treaty existed throughout this territory, only land sharing agreements to allow posts on Indigenous lands. So the ways that we have been teaching these histories erases Indigenous people, erases Indigenous political action, erases Indigenous agriculture and trade long before they have ceased to be the dominant presence on the land. And we have to rethink that deeply. So that is where I will end. And Marc, are you here? All right, Marc's here. Marc Kruse is a Director of Indigenous Legal Learning and Services at Robeson Hall. He is also an associate with Rees Dick Rogala Law Offices, where he practices criminal defense, representing youth and adult clients. His research interests focus on the relationship between philosophical ethics, political history, and law, with special focus on the ways educational institutions can ameliorate or exacerbate legal problems. He's published work on the moral foundations of professional ethics, social justice, and Indigenous educational ethics. Cruz completed his JD at the University of Manitoba and co-teaches Robeson Hall's Indigenous requirement course, Indigenous Methodologies and Perspectives. He's a member of the Musqueam First Nation in Saskatchewan. So you must do this one?
Yeah.
There we go.
All right, good morning, everyone. I want to thank the organizers for putting this event on and for everyone being here today for this teach-in. I have a lot of history to get through in about 20 minutes, so there's more information on the slides than I'll get through, but the basis of my talk comes from Call to Action 45, where the TRC, on behalf of all Canadians, calls on the Canadian government to create a royal proclamation of reconciliation. And that needs to be based on the Treaty of Niagara and the Royal Proclamation, 1763 and 1764. I wanted to focus on this call to action in no small part because most people don't know about Niagara. They don't know about the Silver Covenant Chain or the Two-World Wampum. So how are we ever going to action this call if most Canadians don't know these things, including our judges and our politicians? And so It also reinforces the idea that when we talk about truth and reconciliation, we really need truth first. We need to have this history and understanding so we can get to a place of mutual respect and mutual understanding. And also, for the purpose of this talk, this call also calls on the government to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, to base this declaration on the United Nations declarations of the rights of Indigenous people, to renew the treaty relationships based on mutual understanding and respect, and then to reconcile Aboriginal and Crown constitutional and legal orders. So what that means, from my perspective, is looking for sovereignty, really getting self-determination and self-governance for Indigenous peoples, but wrestling with that. How is that going to work with the Confederation model we have? Can our Confederation model survive this call to action? And how are we going to have these discussions? So a few brief notes just about treaty and treaty interpretations. The pre-Confederate treaties and the numbered treaties, the numbered treaties specifically have been considered just to be simple land surrenders from our common law perspective and our government's perspective. And if we acknowledge any pre-Confederate treaties, they would also be land surrenders, something like the Selkirk Treaty, for example. So Ame Croft wrote her dissertation and turned into a book, Breathing Life into the Stonefort Treaty, where we have the oral history of all parties, the Catholic Church, the government representatives, the Indigenous nations, and the Métis were all present at Treaty 1. And her book is a reminder that we need both sides of this narrative to really have that history. Again, reinforcing the focus on truth before we even start talking about how to reconcile these truths. From the Indigenous perspective, it's important to note that treaties are relationship documents. It was always a kinship relationship, and it was an invitation to settlers to join in, for the Haudenosaunee, the Great Law of Peace, but for other nations, still that kinship relationship, because it was an understanding that Turtle Island was a land of abundance, not a land of scarcity, and that it was about sharing the bounty of the earth, but also sharing the responsibilities of all of our relations. Another important note for all of these treaties, the pre-Confederate and the numbered treaties, was that they would have been done in ceremony. They would have started with a pipe ceremony. They would have been done in view of the Creator and the ancestors, and so they are sacred documents as well. Also, they are not frozen in time. A treaty is not a contract. It's not an international contract. Our Supreme Court has acknowledged this as well. The Supreme Court calls them sui generis, a nice Latin word that means of themselves. And that actually kind of works with this Indigenous framework as well. There is this understanding that treaties are a living thing, not a frozen in time document. So I like to use the sort of metaphor of treaties are a marriage. It's a document that binds two nations into a shared responsibility, and also a recognition that that's a start of the relationship, not the end of it. It's not the final say on the relationship. It's just a declaration that we are joining together. To push the narrative of Canada back, I think Dr. Miller's talk was great, sort of showing that these ideas and these histories go back before any settlers were even on Turtle Island. And if we think about treaties, Indigenous folk had been on Turtle Island since time immemorial. They've had treaties, or if they didn't get to that sort of sacred covenant place, there was agreements, there would have been shared understandings, and I'll get into some of those from the wampum perspective in the future here in this talk. So the example I use in the talk usually is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This is an oral history of the peacemaker. So since time immemorial, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had existed in Turtle Island, but there was a time when the nations were warring. And so the Creator sent the peacemaker to teach the law, the Great Law of Peace, to all the nations and bring them together. So I'm going to flip through the slides because there's quite a bit of information here. But there is a recognition that the different nations would have different responsibilities. This confederacy was broken up into different clan systems or totem systems, and each of those clans and nations would have separate responsibilities. This confederacy is based and uses the metaphor of the great tree of peace, and you'll see that represented in a wampum coming up. The Confederacy, again, is based on peace. There is a recognition that no warring should take place. If we're coming together to meet in discourse and dialogue and diplomacy, that we couldn't have any weapons at these meetings. We had to bury our own personal interests, or each nation's personal interests, and come together again to build a relationship. So this story is sort of codified and remembered in a series of wampum belts. I have a slide here for wampum because I realize that some folk may have never heard of wampum before. So they are made of these white shells. You can kind of see they have this purpley white hue. The shells would have been sort of bent and attached to lines of hide. You can see on the bottom there can be simple, just sort of strings, like one string, or they can be put together to make different sort of pictographs of sorts. So we'll see that coming up here. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Great Law of Peace are sort of codified and remembered in this wampum belt, the Five Nation Belt. You can see the tree in the center there. The squares are the other nations. At the bottom there, it explains sort of where each nation fits on this belt. Each of those nations would, again, have different responsibilities that would be understood. There'd be knowledge keepers that knew these belts. These belts would be brought out at every gathering, and it would be remembered what was said and what those obligations were. And sometimes this belt can be seen upside down, and this tree can also represent a heart. This is the circle wampum that the peacemaker gave to the Confederacy, which sort of outlines the political structure. So each of those lines represents one of the 50 chiefs. The line that extends into the bottom represents the people. So again, this is sort of a mnemonic device that would remind everyone where their place was, but this was also how they would gather around the tree whenever the Confederacy got together. So from that quick history, it should be fairly clear that there was a complex legal order here. There was a complex political structure with governing rules and protocols and understandings that went back hundreds, thousands of years before settlers arrived. So this myth of terra nullius, or unclaimed lands, as if there was no jurisdiction here, or legal or political structures, is just a false narrative. Dr. Miller discussed the bowl with one spoon. So this is the belt that she was describing. You can see sort of the circular structure representing the dish or the bowl, the center line being the spoon. It was recognized that this is a sharing treaty for resources, but also a recognition of peace again. It's not a knife or sharp edge that we're going to be sharing with our bounty. It's going to be a spoon or something that's blunted edged. Again, a recognition that this is about peace and sharing. This is one of the more famous wampum belts, so hopefully some of you have seen this before. This is the two-row wampum belt, and it's a belt that recognizes shared sovereignties and jurisdictions. This belt was between Indigenous nations before settlers arrived, and then was extended to settlers once they came. So the sort of blue or purple beads represent a waterway, the white represents the lands, and there is a recognition that there would be a vessel in each of these waterways, one for the Indigenous, say a canoe or other vessel, and the European ships in the other. So a recognition that we're traversing the same waterways, the same lands, but we wouldn't interfere with each other's vessels, and the vessels representing basically our political autonomy and legal orders. Our history shows that in 1613, this was between nations, and that this belt was also extended to the Dutch later on. And interestingly, in this oral history, when the Dutch was negotiating with the Indigenous folk, they were asking to be called father and wanted to call the Indigenous people son. The Indigenous folk resisted that dichotomy and said, no, we are brothers. We are equals. We have the same responsibilities and respect. But also this language reinforces that notion that Indigenous people thought this was a familial relationship. This is a kinship relationship that we're extending here. So the brother narrative also fits within that sort of understanding and structure. So Jumping now to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Interestingly, this document looks very similar to the Spanish document when the Spanish government was trying to get control of the conquistadors, basically saying that all lands couldn't be taken from Indigenous peoples without the authority of the Crown. And a reminder to the settlers that were here, the colonizers, that these lands and these sort of city-states that you're developing always must be in line with the interests of the Crown. So this decree comes out, or this proclamation in 1763. At the time, Sir William Johnson is the sort of main agent for the Crown that's dealing with Indigenous peoples. He gets notice that this proclamation is coming out. He understands immediately that he's going to have this translated and sort of given to the Indigenous nations so that they understand what the king is sort of promising here. Already knowing that they had previous alliances with some nations and needed to bring them back together. There is clearly some concerns about the rumblings of the American Revolution, and we'll see that happened very soon after this. Again, in no small part because a lot of the founding fathers in America were landowners and land speculators who were benefiting from taking lands under the colonial protocols. So when this proclamation comes out, they can no longer purchase lands without the king's or the Crown's approval. So the proclamation, again, is a complicated document. It only states the king or the Crown's perspective. It doesn't talk, and it didn't sort of contemplate the Indigenous narrative or the Indigenous worldviews. John Burroughs and others have argued that the proclamation does actually become a treaty, though, at the Treaty of Niagara. So Sir William Johnson, again, recognizing that he would need to give this information to the Indigenous people, called for a gathering at Niagara. We know that over 2,000 Indigenous people answered that call, where this document was presented to them and the information provided to them. And more importantly than just the Royal Proclamation, they also created the Silver Covenant Wampum. So this is the Silver Covenant chain. It represents the agreement that was made at Niagara. You can see that it has numbers on it for the first time. This is a real sort of fusion of colonial law and Indigenous law. It's also a sign that the Crown respected Indigenous legal orders at the time, understood that they needed to treat with Indigenous folk, and that in this photo, you can see the middle there, there's two individuals holding hands, and that would represent the Crown and Indigenous nations. And they're linking arms, and that's extending into sort of those other symbols which would represent different nations. And this belt also reminds us that there is more than just the written word or the wampum, that often holding and linking arms or other sort of physical acts would be part of these protocols and procedures as well. And it's known as the Silver Covenant chain. If you start studying treaties, you'll notice that silver is often the metal that's assigned in a belt, or actual physical silver treaty metals. And that's in part because it's noted that both nations recognize silver as a precious metal, but that also silver tarnishes over time, and that it must be polished to stay bright and to shine. So the Silver Covenant chain, even in its sort of metaphor, was a recognition that this is a living document, this is a living relationship, and we'll need to come together from time to time to air our grievances, to polish that chain, and to have good relations. And I should say, from the Indigenous worldview, that is something that should happen with every treaty. They are, again, living documents that need to be reinvigorated, which is why Ame called her book Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty. We need to breathe life back into these documents and into these relationships. I'm trying to figure out how much more time do we have? About 5. We're getting pretty close. We're getting pretty close. So the Silver Covenant chain, again, is a strong symbol, I think, and a place that we can reconcile to in a way. This is a clear example of mutual respect and mutual understanding. It's a clear example that the Crown recognized Indigenous authorities and jurisdiction and, dare I say, title to these lands. And that there was a way and there was a time and place where we came together and we were able to live well. After Silver Covenant chain, we do know for at least 80 years, they did gather and stay and reinvigorate and polish the chain. There was a few other wampum belts that were presented at this time. One of them signified the promises of the king to bring bounty to the nation and to share that. And we do know that again, that continued to happen. It's not really until after the War of 1812, American Confederation, Canadian Confederation, where we start losing this sort of relationship. And then we start losing this narrative. We lose this history. So again, John Burroughs and other Indigenous scholars such as myself do think of the Treaty of Niagara as potentially the birthplace of Canada, or what we would then become Canada. It's at least the forming of that third relationship, English, French, and Indigenous. So we need that recognition that Canada has always had three pillars of law and politics and worldviews, and that our country is a pluralistic place where we need to again, reinvigorate and breathe life into these relationships. So this is why the truth portion is so important. So in these discussions and on Orange Shirt Days and such, we talk about needing to know the truth of the residential schools. But I hope after Carrie and my talk, we also need to know the truth of our actual world history. How did Canada come to be in the first place? We have to start those discussions hundreds of years before Confederation. And I think this would give Canadians a more fulsome view of who they are. And a brief note, the Treaty of Niagara also led to Indigenous nations joining Canada in the War of 1812, I should say, the British in the War of 1812 against the Americans. So it's much more Tecumseh and the Indigenous militias that fought back the Americans, and Canada wouldn't even had a chance to exist because American expansionism would have came up north if we didn't have these treaties. Not just the Silver Covenant chain, but several other covenant chains and peace and friendship treaties. So we need that history even to extend and understand how Canada got here. Because I think if you're in Politics 101 and they ask you, what is Canada or who are Canadians, most people have trouble answering that question. And I think that's in no small part because we haven't honored our treaty history. We haven't honored the fact that we only exist as a nation because of these wampums, these pre-Confederate histories, and the spirit and the will of Indigenous sort of military force. And so as we're going through these talks and discussions, I think we need to have that historical perspective as well. And this is the only way we can return to a place of mutual respect and mutual understanding. We need to revitalize Indigenous nations so they can relearn this history as well. Because a lot of this was lost, this history of wampum, again, in a small part because of the residential school assimilation policies. So much of these belts have ended up in museums, in universities, or actually were buried with chiefs. So we're in a phase of revitalizing this history from the Indigenous oral history side of things. So for those of us here in the Academy, these are some of those projects that we need to revitalize. We need to save languages, Indigenous legal orders, oral histories, because it is all of our histories, actually. This is the foundation of Canada, yeah, I think I'll just sort of end it there. And I want to thank all of you for attending today and giving us your time. And hopefully you have some more things to contemplate over the weekend for the actual day on the 30th. So thank you. Miigwech.
So, and with that, I'll invite up Brenda Gun, and I will give a very short introduction as we are running out of time. But she's a proud Métis woman, a University of Manitoba law professor, and also the Research and Education Director at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation.
Wait, don't go yet. I don't know how to open this. Can you all hear me whispering that I don't know how to open a USB on the computer?
Is yours already in?
I just put it in right there.
Oh, so then it's over here.
I use a Mac, that is my excuse. So maybe just while my fantastic tech support here, we're upgrading the tech support. I just want to start by thanking each and every one of you for coming today. And it's, yeah, the DOD one. Thanks. Oh, good thing I hid all the family photos that were in that one. You could have seen my family Christmas photos for the last 3 years. It's been a really amazing and challenging, difficult and inspiring week for us at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. This is the week where we do a lot of our work. We have been running an education program for students across the country. We had over 20,000 classrooms register. We've been doing daily lunch and learns, and we've had over 2,000 people sign in. And so for me, I'm just about done. I have 2 more media interviews, this presentation, and 1 more panel. But it's such important work. We try really hard to do the survivors justice and really share all of the truths that they've given to us with all of you. So I really appreciate you taking the time to start and continue on an educational journey. And so in 5 minutes or less, what I'm gonna try to do is weave together a little bit about the Doctrine of Discovery, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and reconciliation. And I can't do it by talking super fast because the echo in here is like mind-blowing, and so it slows my thought process even more. So starting point number 1, it has been said by everyone so far today, but we really need to remind ourselves that Indigenous peoples are self-governing nations, right? And so with the arrival of newcomers, there were existing systems already in place. And so my colleagues have done a phenomenal job of walking us through some key points in history of how the Doctrine of Discovery was coming into play. But I want to specifically connect it to residential schools. And I see myself as just sort of finishing off the weave that we've been starting today. And so what I have on the slide is a quote from Chief Justice Marshall in a case in 1823 that is often cited as the one that brought in the Doctrine of Discovery into the Americas. This is an American case, but it has been cited by Canadian courts repeatedly, so it has a basis for it. But the Doctrine of Discovery very explicitly is condoned because Indigenous peoples were fierce savages whose occupation was war. So that is the basis upon which Europeans view themselves as having some sort of legitimate claim to what we now call Canada and the US. So this gets continued on then, this journey of racism and colonial dominance by Sir John A. Macdonald when he starts setting up residential schools. And he says, when the school is on reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. So part of what I think we all in Canada need to really deeply understand is that residential schools were not schools. They were institutions of genocide, right? They were designed not to, do some reading and writing, arithmetic, the 3 R's or whatever it was called. It was an institution set up to continue to perfect the colonial dominance of Europe. And so by 1920, we have Duncan Campbell Scott continuing on to say our object is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. So when we think about why are we talking about the Doctrine of Discovery and reconciliation, where does it come from? It's that basis that Canada tries to create legitimacy and has continued to be woven through every policy that has been passed since that time. And so the work we need to do when we talk about reconciliation then is to start by rejecting the paternalistic and racist foundations that start with the Doctrine of Discovery, that continue on through residential schools and continue to exist in many different Canadian policies where Canadian governments continue to think they are in a better position to make decisions for Indigenous peoples. And so the TRC report sheds some light as to what reconciliation might look like and what do we need to do, what is the work ahead of us, right? So a big part of what they're doing is talking about developing and building, maintaining, establishing mutually respectful relationships. Some of those relationships that were originally envisioned in some of the documents that Marc was talking about. And so this is what we need to be keeping in mind as we're working through the education process, as we're educating those around us, is that the work of reconciliation requires Canada to go back to its core and think about establishing new relationships. And where are we trying to go? We're trying to transform Canadian society so that our children and grandchildren can live together in dignity, peace, prosperity on the lands we now share. Right? This isn't about a balance that we're trying to shift and take things away, but it's about recognizing that Canada is a human rights country, a country that says it appreciates and aspires to uphold and have human rights, that we all need to have access to those same human rights. And so that's, for me, why the UN Declaration provides that powerful framework for reconciliation, because it starts by recognizing that Indigenous peoples are peoples, right? Because our story in Canada, the Canadian country story, starts with a very racist story and dominance. And so what we need to do then is start by recognizing Indigenous peoples as peoples who can make decisions for ourselves. And we need to use the rights that are recognized in the UN Declaration as the floor, as the basis for a relationship moving forward. And by doing so, we can maybe begin to reconcile in Canada. And so once we get through that idea that Indigenous peoples are peoples, then we can start to work through this idea that yes, we can make decisions for ourselves. We are the best people positioned to make decisions for ourselves, and that's what self-determination is, right? It's Indigenous peoples deciding for themselves how they want to organize, how they want to govern, how they want to take care of their families. And we do this through our own institutions, and we continue to engage in the Canadian political state as we choose as well. And so a big part of what we push for at the NCTR is the truth before reconciliation. We have to learn the truth, and I just thought I would throw back up there some of the areas that the TRC highlighted that we need to learn about and talk about in this process towards reconciliation. I actually might do this in 15 minutes. So learning our teaching today is an amazing first step, but it's not the end point of our journey. Yes, education is important, but you learning and changing how you think and see the world is the first step. We need to then figure out what action we can take to make changes in Canada to the systems that continue to perpetuate racism against Indigenous peoples, founded in those deeply racist doctrines that we've talked about. And then this is really critical, teach others. The NCTR Education Unit is amazing and powerful and 3 people. We cannot do it on our own, and so we work with allies, we work with other institutions, but all of you have circles of influence in your lives, your friends, your families, your communities, your churches, your neighborhoods, your cities, your provinces. We are at a time in Manitoba where these issues are front and center and alive every day. Uh-oh, I'm gonna cry and I'm gonna get very political. Maybe I should stop here. Maybe I need to put not my NCTR hat on, but my personal hat. But I think many of you know what we're talking about, right? I see shirts that says every child matters. I want to see this province actually show us that our lives matter, Can I say that? That's not overly political. I'm not going to lose my job for that one? No? Okay. So taking action when and where that opportunity shows, gives yourself the opportunity. I'm going to share some information. The NCTR has partnered with Meta to provide an educational experience where you can learn more about the history and legacy of residential school through an interactive messenger experience. It's a pretty neat way to walk through and learn some of this history of residential schools and hear from survivors. So apparently that funny picture on there in the middle in the orange, you take a picture with your phone and it does things. This granny doesn't know, so I'm gonna leave it there. I did it 15 minutes, not 10, but 15. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. And I want to echo what Brenda said. So many people, after we give presentations like this, say, what is it that I can do? And I think the bottom line is look at where you are, think about what can be changed where you are, whatever profession that you're in, even as a student. What can I do to interrupt anti-Indigenous racism and move us towards a better society? So with that, we're going to move over to the green space in front of Helen Glass for the next portion of the day's events. We're going to be led by our elder, Donna Green. So we're asking all of you to exit from the third floor while we assemble down on the first behind Donna and walk over to Helen Glass. Thank you very much for your time today. It's very appreciated. And could the speakers come up front for some photos?